Hi, my name is June Hur, and I'm the author of Korean Historical Mysteries.
Born in Korea and raised in Canada, June's third book is about the historical Korean tragedy of Prince Sado. She has previously published 2 other books with a 4th book in the works. Hi, I'm Gemma and welcome to The Red Carpet. With me today is author June Hur, and she's here with her book, The Red Palace. Hi June, happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me here.
I got a chance to read the advanced reader's copy, and the murder mystery during the Joseon period kept me on the edge of my seat. Can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Yeah, so The Red Palace, this is coming out on January 25th, and it's about a palace nurse and a young police inspector who team up to investigate into a grisly string of murders, but things get complicated when the prime suspect becomes the crown prince himself.
I enjoyed the book so much. I'm so happy to have you here with us so that we can discuss more about books. So your previous books, The Silence of Bones and The Forest of Stolen Girls, also feature historical mysteries. What are your interests in historical mysteries?
That's a great question. So when I began, I wrote British historical fiction, but then after a while, after I failed to get it published, I was like, what other histories would I be interested in? So I majored in history, so I have a love of history, and so I looked into different histories around the world, but I didn't feel like I was the right person to write about the histories of other countries, and then so I'm like, okay, let's look into Korean history. I don't know much about it, even though I was born there, I went to high school there, but I slept through all my history classes, and so I finally picked up a Korean history textbook of sorts, and then I read through it and I fell absolutely head over heels in love with it, and I was so overwhelmed by the fact that I'd missed out on so much richness about Korean's past. And so I read up more about it, and then the reason why I wrote Korean histories is because I wanted to shout off the rooftop that Korean history is so fascinating and I'd love everyone else to learn more about it. And so I took that passion and I just wrote the book that I was struggling to find on shelves here in Canada.
You write a lot of young adult books, but how do you not cross the line when it comes to murder?
I take comfort in the fact that teens know how to self-censor, and so I try to be as honest about what happened in history. But one thing I do try to do now is not try to be too graphic. Sometimes I can't help it. It's like I love details, and so sometimes maybe it's a bit too much for some readers, but other readers, I guess they're okay with it. So I'm still trying to find that balance, but I really rely on the fact that teens are smart. They know when something is too much for them, and they'll just skim over it.
So you mentioned that you experienced growing up in South Korea for high school, but you grew up in Canada. Did that have an influence on your books?
For sure. So I grew up in Canada. I spent most of my life in Canada, but I was raised by very traditional Korean parents, and so initially I wasn't able to differentiate like what part of me is Canadian, what part of me is Korean. But when I went to high school in Korea and I spent around 3-4 years in Korea, that time there really helped me identify, like these values that I have are actually Korean. It's not just these random quirks I grew up with. Things like filial piety, or being really conscious of the hierarchical system, like respecting your elders. Those kind of values I didn't know were Korean until I went to Korea. And what really resonated with me about Korean culture was just the communal mentality. Like I was raised with that in Canada, and going to Korea made me realize, oh, like I really feel at home with this kind of mindset. So that kind of value that I realized was very Korean of me, I was able to focus on in my own books, and so I was able to take the traditions that I was raised with, that I knew were Korean, to inspire and mold my book. And then the Canadian side of me that really influenced me was, like, I went to university, and at university we really focused a lot on like feminism, post-colonial studies, and feminism particularly became the lens through which I viewed Korean history. So that's why I focus a lot on women and the marginalized, especially marginalized women. So yeah.
I know that you debuted as a writer during COVID. Your first book came out in April 2020. What was that like to debut during this time?
It was interesting because I'm a hermit. I love staying at home and staying in my PJs. And so it didn't disappoint me too much because I enjoyed being able to do all my events in the comfort of my home. And I was surprisingly moved by how much support I got through the virtual events. Like, when I had my book launch online, I thought no one would be there, but there were so many friends and new readers that joined to support me and to cheer me on. And so I had so much fun through the virtual events, and I've had fun through all virtual events that I've had so far. So it's actually been a pretty good experience.
Circling back to Red Palace, what was your research process like? And did you take creative liberties when it came to essentially your characters?
Mm-hmm. So I've always been interested in Crown Prince Hado since I first began researching for my first book, which takes place a few years after his death. But I never felt confident enough to write about him. I've always I wrote like a few scenes with him as the main character, but nothing ever really felt right, and I never felt comfortable writing through his perspective. And so I held off on writing about that period for a while until recently, when my editor was kind of like, oh, like, you mentioned you wanted to write about a palace nurse and a royal inspector. And she was like, why don't you make them a main character in your next book? And I was like, oh, and that instantly, just like figuring out who the main characters would be, instantly made me realize, okay, I want to look into Prince Hado's life from the outside. And so the research for this book was surprisingly not as difficult, because there's a entire book based on his life written by Lady Haegyang, who is his wife. And so her memoir really delved into detail about his life and his spiraling and ultimately his death. And it was so detailed and so emotional. And yeah, like, I cried so many times while reading about Prince Hado. And there's so many resources outside of the memoirs that people have tapped into, because so many people in Korea are fascinated by his life. And so I was able to look into that as well. But obviously I did have to take creative liberties.
Can you tease the audience with something from your book?
Sure. So there is one line that I wrote, and it became like a little blurb over here. And it reads, "If you enter the palace, you either die or you survive and become another monster within its walls. ...
So I heard that you also have a announcement to make for everyone.
Oh, yes. I am pregnant with my second baby.
Congratulations on that. I know motherhood and writing at the same time is going to be tough, but do you have anything to say to anyone who is also walking in the same path as you?
Yeah. So I think when I was first pregnant, I was actually really scared, because a lot of media kind of portrays parenthood, motherhood in general, as something that ends the career, and is a disease or something, and something to be ashamed of, or something. Well, not ashamed, but basically something to be seen as a burden. And so I see a lot of mothers being portrayed as, like, they sacrifice, they give up their dreams, and they give up their everything. And so that's how I always kind of envisioned motherhood, especially as a child of an immigrant family. Like, you just see mothers always sacrificing. I'm like, I don't want to sacrifice everything. And it just sounded so hard. But a lot of writers shared their stories, and it was so encouraging. And yeah, like after I had my daughter, and then now with the second pregnancy, I really learned that, you know, we as women and we as human beings in general, like, we know how to persevere. We'll make the time if possible. And I realized as long as you have a very strong support system, like family who will really step up to support you, it's possible to pursue your dreams. It's possible to do whatever it is you want to do. And so I've written way more than I had even before I had a child. Like, I wrote 3 books. I don't think I wrote that much before I was pregnant or had a child to take care of. And so yeah, like, you just know how to do the work that you need to do with the time that you have. Yeah, you just learn how to be efficient, basically.
Right. Congratulations once again.
Thank you.
So, where can we find your books?
So you can find my books wherever books are sold, hopefully.
And where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at writer June Hur, and on Instagram at June H Writes.
I hope you enjoyed our time with June. Don't forget to check out her book. And if you enjoyed what you saw here, you can find more conversations with authors here. I'm Gemma for the Kpop-TV Entertainment Network. I'll see you next time.